In this question, we're given 4 graphs. We have graph A, graph B, graph C, and graph D. Now the graphs represent 4 different types of the function f, and we need to match each description of the function in the table to the letter of its graph. Now we have 4 descriptions in the table. We have f of x is inversely proportional to x, f of x is a trigonometrical function, f of x is an exponential function, and f of x is directly proportional. Now let's make a note on the table about what each of these descriptions really mean. Now if f of x is inversely proportional to x, we know that f of x is directly proportional to 1 over x. And that swirly sign that looks like an incomplete infinity sign is the symbol for proportionality, so this means that f of x is directly proportional to 1 over x. Then we have f of x is a trigonometrical function, so this means that f of x equals sin x, cos x, tan x, or any other trigonometrical function. Then we have f of x is an exponential function, so this means that the graph would be something to the power of x. Then we have f of x is directly proportional to the square root of x, and we can use that same proportionality symbol to say that f of x is proportional to the square root of x. Now let's take a look at our graphs again. So we need to be able to identify each of these graphs. Now let's start with graph A. We should be able to recognise that graph A is a graph of sin x. But since we don't know the values in the graph, we'll say that graph A is a graph of a sin x, where a is any positive constant. So for example, graph A could be a graph of 5 sin x, 10 sin x, 2 sin x. We wouldn't know unless we know the values of the maximum and minimum points, but that's okay. We just know that graph A is a graph of a sin x. Now let's look at graph B. Now you might have seen this graph before, and this is a graph of a over x, where again a is just a positive constant. Now we'll move on to graph D. Graph D is a graph of a to the power of x, where a, again, is a positive constant. Now graph C is something that you may not have seen before, but that's okay. We can use our knowledge of graph A, graph B, and graph D to eliminate and use the table to find out what graph C is. Graph C is the graph of a root x, where again, a is a positive constant. Now it's likely that you would have come across these graphs in the past few years, but if you haven't, that's okay, because now you're able to recognise them. Now let's go back to our table. So the first one, f of x is inversely proportional to x, which means that f of x needs to be proportional to 1 over x. Now looking at our graphs, we can see that graph B fits the description. And so graph B is inversely proportional to x. Then we have f of x is a trigonometrical function. Now the graph of a sin x is definitely a trigonometrical function, and so we can write graph A in our table. Then we have f of x is an exponential function. We said that exponential means something to the power of x. We said that graph D is the graph of a to the power of x, and so we can say that graph D is an exponential function. And finally, we have f of x is directly proportional to root x. We said that graph C is the graph of a root x, and so graph C is directly proportional to the square root of x. And so by correctly filling in the table, we've now achieved the full 2 marks needed in this question.